Hi friends, this is Lorelei Black from Blade Broom Botanica. In this episode we're going to talk about why and how to work with your ancestors. I know that there are some folks out there who have not started working with their ancestors yet. Maybe they're just working with elemental spirits, or they're working with god forms, or other types of spirits they've read about in books, but they haven't really reached out to their own ancestors. And so I wanted to talk about some reasons why really working with your own ancestors is one of the first things that you want to be doing in witchcraft. I wanted to start the conversation by saying that ancestor work is one of the oldest types of spirit work that we see across the world in both official religious practices and also in folk practices. We even see it today. So we just came out of Memorial Day here in the US. That was just last week. So Memorial Day is an official holiday in which the idea is not necessarily that you fire up the grill, though that's what we pretty much all do, is fire up the grill, go out to the lake, all that kind of stuff. But it was initiated as an opportunity to go and decorate the graves of deceased loved ones. It used to be called Decoration Day. And where I'm from, where my family is still rooted, in parts of the South and Southwest, it's still called Decoration Day. And it's not actually celebrated on Memorial Day there. Actually, it's celebrated on Mother's Day. So we actually have two Memorial Days in those parts of the country. So, and this will be familiar to some people that are watching. So on Decoration Day, people go to the cemeteries and they usually contribute to the cemetery where most of their family is buried. They'll give money, or they'll pledge money to the cemetery upkeep in general, and then they'll go and spend time taking care of their family plot and putting out new flowers and just sort of doing some general care there. And then a lot of times they'll have a picnic, they visit with their neighbors. It's a small rural area and that kind of thing. So, there's a lot of visiting that goes on. Both my mother's family and my father's family are actually buried right next to each other. So even though my parents divorced years ago, there's a lot of like, oh, I saw so-and-so at Decoration Day and we visited and it was really nice. You won't believe what was going on with them. Well, yeah, I do actually know, because I still talk to, they're all my family. But so in places where Decoration Day is a separate holiday from Memorial Day, you have a set of rituals and customs that are very focused on those cemetery and funerary customs. And then you have all of the sort of opening of summer things that have become the more contemporary Memorial Day customs. And then there's still in the background of the American consciousness this idea that Memorial Day is not just the opening of summer festivities, but also we're welcoming summer while at the same time saying goodbye again to those who have passed. And so sometimes you'll see within some groups the idea of who are you remembering? At the other end of the seasonal wheel, I think it's worth noting that the Samhain season, or Halloween, All Saints Day, Dia de los Muertos, whatever name you want to call it, that October 31st, November 1st date is firmly implanted in the European and American, and I use that term loosely, like throughout all of the Americas, that time period, that window of time is firmly, and it's really sort of a couple of weeks period of time, firmly rooted in our consciousness as this is the time to get in touch with the dead. This is the time to honor the dead. There are a wealth of traditions, both secular and religious, that go hand in hand with that. We're not getting rid of that anytime soon. It is deeply embedded within our psyches. So, and it's interesting, right, that that's both May and October-ish. So May-ish, October-ish, And it's a time when certainly the Celtic speaking peoples, that Celtic language group speaking peoples, had noted that, hey, the veils are thin here. There's something happening. The dead are talking to us. And so our ancestors seem to want to come through then. And I would argue that our ancestors always kind of want to come through. It's just at those times that they're really getting our attention. So it's those times when they're talking loud enough and we're listening closely enough, or we're able to listen closely enough that we hear them. So really there are a lot of reasons why you ought to be working with your ancestors. There are a lot of reasons why people do work with their ancestors. And a lot of the reasons are intensely personal, and I can't figure those out for you, right? Like you might have your own reasons why you want to work with the ancestors. And if so, then you don't need me to convince you. I came up with 5 general reasons that I think are great for people to work with ancestors, and that I think that I'm seeing as broad spectrum reasons why people do work with ancestors. The first one is continuity of cycles. So in general terms, by working with our ancestors, we see our connection to the past and our connection to the future. At some point, we're going to be the ancestors, right? And so there's this idea of what is remembered lives. By remembering our ancestors and by working with them, whether they're recent ancestors, the ones that we actually met and remembered, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, people whose laps we sat on and feet we sat at and heard their stories and knew their laughs and saw their faces and ate their food, and were at their tables and went to their funerals. We're able to remember them in our homes and in our hearts in a very real way. And we're able to keep them with us in that way. They never die if we remember them. But further back than that, we're able to learn the stories or have handed down to us the stories of further back grandparents and keep them alive too. And that's meaningful for us as people. It's a hard thing in some ways to think that someday there may be a generation that has no idea who you were as an individual. And that may yet happen, right? Even if we do our best to remember our ancestors, someday there may be nobody to remember who you were. And that is something that all of us must face. Like, we have to do the work to come to grips with that and be at peace with that. And at the same time, it is good and solid work to still honor what has come before us. It puts us into perspective. And it shows us a guidepost or a blueprint for the future, right? Because we're leaving this to somebody, and it might not be our children. We might not be choosing to have children. That might not be the choice that we're making, but we're leaving this world and we're leaving our practices to some future generation. And so there are going to be inheritors coming after us. And so it gives us that sense of something beyond ourselves, and it helps put our ego into perspective, and it helps us see our place within the world and give us that sense of cycle, that sense of continuity, that sense of self in relation to others. So that's one reason, and I think it's a powerful one. Another reason is preservation of heritage, preservation of history and of values and of the things that we value, So, and again, those things may be intensely personal, or they may be really very general. So this can be on a cultural level, this can be on a social level, this can be on a familial level. When I'm talking about ancestors, these may be literally your genealogical ancestors, and these may, in some cases, be ancestors of spirit. So social ancestors or cultural ancestors, spiritual ancestors, if I'm hoping that all of that makes sense. My father was adopted, so there are parts of my heritage that are really hard for me to figure out. I think I have in some places because he was adopted. Well, I'm not going to get into all my story, right? He was adopted within contexts that I think I've been able to figure some things out, but there are some wonky spots, right? And then there are some other things like, let's see, how do I do this? For a lot of us, if you're American and your family's been here for a while, or sometimes even if that's not the case, there are a lot of gaps in your family history where you're never going to get answers. You're just not. And you can dig and you can poke and you can prod and you can pay all the fees you want to Ancestry.com and you're never going to figure it out. So, because the records just don't exist. And you can ask for all the family Bibles you want, nobody wrote it down. And there are folks who have complicated relationships with the ancestors that are in their immediate family lines, and they don't want to have much to do with them. But then there are the ancestors beyond them. Families are complicated. There's a lot to figure out. There's just so much that we can learn by reaching out to our roots and trying to figure out what's there. By working with our ancestors, we can also gain a sense of belonging, especially belonging to a family or greater family. And again, that sense of family is both of our blood and also of our soul. I think sometimes the hesitation for folks to reach out to do ancestor work can be based on things like coming from families where adoption and fostering and complicated immediate family relationships have existed. Complicated or painful or ugly immediate family relationships have existed. And I would encourage you to go beyond that in looking into your ancestors, because a lot of times healing can happen by getting past those first few people with whom you've had contact or haven't had contact. And that brings me to the fourth reason that a lot of people do ancestor work, that they dive into ancestor work, is actually for healing. And so we have personal healing that can happen from doing ancestor work, and we actually have generational healing that can happen from doing ancestor work. And I feel like that generational healing is a big topic, right? So it's sort of a giant topic that we could really do a deep dive on, and that maybe we ought to save that one for a different episode because there's really a lot there. But the concept behind that is that because of the way our souls work, the way that many shamanic cultures, including a lot of traditional witchcraft, sees the way the soul working, with it being three parts, that tripartite soul that we've talked about here in this channel, and I'll link to it down below so you can follow up on that if you like. We carry parts of ancestral trauma with us, and we're tied to what's happened before, even if it didn't happen to us directly, and we're tied to trauma that our ancestors may have inflicted as well. And that's a lot to recover from and to heal from and to work through and to own up to and to have to deal with. And that's work that needs to be done on all sides. So, and I think we're especially looking at that right now, right? Like it's it's coming up, it's in our faces. We're going to have to do that work. So that healing is a very real part of what it is that we can do through ancestor work. It's not easy, but it's there and it's available. So that's one of the things. And I think another one of the big reasons that people seek out ancestor work, or one of the ways that people benefit from ancestor work, is protection. So our ancestors were tough. We wouldn't have gotten to where we are. We wouldn't be here if we didn't come from strong people. You know, we came from people who loved fiercely. You know, you are the product of 1,000 loves, and you are the product of tough, badass, hardy people who made you who you are. You gotta be able to call on them when you're in a pinch and know that the matriarchs of your clan, the patriarchs of your clan, who have been there and been watching over you your whole life, when you call on them with intention and with purpose and say, Grandmama, I need you. Granddaddy, I need you. I'm in a corner and I need you to help dig me out. I need you by my side for this. That they're going to. And they will. Okay, so my advice is you can't come to them on day one saying, hey, so I need stuff. If you haven't been working with them, you need to build up a relationship. And you can't, don't build up the relationship just so you can start asking them for stuff. That's not cool. Build up the relationship because you want to have a relationship with them, right? These are your family. So there are lots and lots and lots of ways that you can honor your ancestors. One of the most basic is just to establish an ancestor altar. So obviously I've been standing in front of mine this whole time. And you can see parts of it here. I'll take a picture and show you, and I will also show you some iterations of other ancestor altars that I've maintained at different places that I've lived. So sometimes it's been more elaborate, and sometimes it's been a little bit less elaborate than this. So for those of you that are living life in the broom closet and are not able to be as free and open with your craft as you would like, one of the fantastic things about the ancestor altar or shrine is that unless you're doing things like having lots of skulls and stuff out, most people aren't going to recognize that it's actually an altar or a shrine. They're just going to think that it's a collection of family photos and mementos and that kind of thing. So you can have just a wall with some old family pictures and maybe a few knickknacks and that kind of thing, and it's just going to look like a collection of antique photos and that type of thing. It's really, really very under the radar. Whether you're keeping a specific altar space or not, you can always make offerings. But if you are keeping an altar going, I would recommend keeping a candle lit while you're awake and present. Please don't ever leave candles going when you're not home or when you're asleep. That's just poor fire safety. But that helps keep the altar warm and awake. And then you can make offerings here at the altar. Or if you don't have that option, you can make your offerings directly outside or establish an altar stone or something like that, on your apartment balcony or somewhere just outside in the space, or just sort of pick a spot outside that makes good sense and make your offerings there on a regular basis. So a spot in the park that you like, or if you are close enough to the family cemetery, you can go and make the offerings at the gravestone of the oldest family member that is buried there as a suggestion. And as far as what those offerings are, you can either choose a food and drink item that you know that they like, or you can make a food and drink item of something traditional. You can almost never go wrong with an offering of alcoholic spirits like the spirits. So anisette is a traditional drink it's a licorice flavored beverage that they like, but also mine often ask for bourbon or whiskey, rum. I've got right now you can see it over here. I've got a vanilla flavored spiced rum that I keep on the altar that I've been offering them. In fact, this entire bottle has only been drunk by them. And that's probably going to continue. So that's theirs. Another thing you could do is, instead of thinking of it in terms of specific foods or drinks, you could just offer the thing you're eating or drinking. You give them first cuts. So the first cuts of meat, or the first servings of the vegetables or side dishes, and then the first pour of the drinks. So that's often a thing that happens in my home when I'm making offerings. Another way to work with ancestors is to research your genealogy, or to learn the stories of your family from the elders that are still living in your family. I find this to be a particularly meaningful way, if you have access to it. A fourth option is to do upkeep on their graves. I mentioned Decoration Day earlier, and you don't have to wait for once a year to do Decoration Day. That can happen much more frequently than that, and you can spend time there, take a picnic, The dumb feast or the dumb supper is not just for Samhain, or it doesn't have to be. So you can have a silent meal with your ancestors any time of the year. That's another way to work with your ancestors and to get to know them, to honor them. So that's taking that food offering and that drink offering a step further, sort of leaning into it and actually sharing that meal with them. One of the ways that I like to do that is to actually have one of my skulls that I use for ancestor representation there with me at the table, and then usually I'll do a litany of family ancestors prior to sitting down to the feast, and again giving them all the first cuts, and then entering into that silent space. You can get really creative with the ways that you reach out to your ancestors. So you can do things like scrapbooking old photos and different mementos that you might have that could work into a scrapbooking format. That's something that I actually did as a project for my stepmother. She had a bunch of loose photos that she'd collected over the years, and they were just sort of jumbled together in boxes and envelopes, and I put them together for her in a scrapbook format. And as a process, I learned a lot about her family, our family. It also put it together in a format that was like a book altar in a way, or a book shrine. And so that's a method that you could use, or some other way that appeals to your sense of art. I've made family tree memory quilts. There's a certain kind of fabric that you can buy from craft stores where you can print sheets of fabric that are paper sized, so 8.5 by 11 roughly, but you can print them on, I think, an inkjet printer, and they're color safe, and then you can incorporate them into a quilt. It's like that for both of my grandmothers, that included pictures of generations, that included my children, myself, my mother or my father, the grandmother that I was giving it to, and then as many generations above them that I had, right? So you could do things like just learning any other traditional art that, or skill or craft that your ancestors would have learned or would have known, which is practically all of them at some point in time, right? Both of my grandmothers sewed, and I have very fond memories of being a child and having them sew clothes for me. When I was about 11, my stepmother taught me to sew. I've been sewing my own clothes since I was about 16 on a regular basis. I've been making things. Blade Broom actually used to sew robes and cloaks on a regular basis. every time I sit down to sew, and most recently it's been face masks, I think of my grandmothers and I think of my stepmother, and I don't think that's ever going to leave me. My great-grandfather was a blacksmith, and though I never met him, when I started learning how to smith, and I'm still learning, but I have done some smithing, and when I hold that hammer and I strike metal on the anvil, I always think of my great-grandfather, among other things. I also think of Tubal Cain, and I think of the many forge gods, but it strikes me as I'm striking metal that this runs in my family, that this is something that is part of my heritage. And so that is a way to connect with those things in our blood. I think one of the most sincere and real ways to connect with your ancestors, though, is just to talk to them on a regular basis. Definitely give them the offerings, but talk to them while you're doing it. Don't just pour whiskey. Pour the whiskey, but have a conversation with them while you're doing it. Offer them a toast. Tell them thank you. Mean it. Be sincere. Let them know what's going on in your life. Don't just throw liquor at them and walk away. Let them know what's up. Say, give them a little status report and say what's going on, like you would call your granny and say, thank you. I really appreciate that thing you did. Here's what's been going on with me and the kids, or, here's what's up with my job, and how are you doing? Include them. I think establishing that connection is really important. So get that connection going, work on your magic, and then you'll be surprised how they show up for you. Sometimes unasked, sometimes you don't have to ask for that favor, but when you need it, after you've got that connection going and you ask, they will show up. They will. So I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. I hope you find it useful. Subscribe, like, share, follow me on other social media. Links down below. I've got resources for you in the description. I will see you later. I've got new episodes coming every Monday at noon Eastern. Bye, guys.